Madame de Courcy, j'aimerais vous remercier chaleureusement.
I would like to warmly thank you for your comments. The involvement of the Canadian government impresses us all. And the first plenary session entitled Setting Context will start. I would like to ask the following speakers to come to the front. First, our moderator, Michael Messenger.
In Canada, an organization benefiting over 480,000 children, emergency response in a variety of crises, and revenue of more than $415 million. Mr. Messenger has traveled regularly to take part in World Vision's efforts around the world. Kelley Lee is Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and Professor, Faculty of Health Sciences, Simon Fraser University. She's trained in international political economy and public administration. Her research analyzes globalization's impacts on communicable and non-communicable diseases and the challenges for collective action. Her research was extensively funded, and she published 14 books and more than 160 papers. Carolyn Leclair has been overseeing the implementation of the government's commitment to support developing countries' efforts to adapt to and mitigate the causes of climate change and representing the government internationally in a number of multilateral organizations. She took on the position of Assistant Deputy Minister of Partnership for Development Innovation last September and hopes that her experience in engaging partners, developing programming, and innovating finance will help her advance her team's vision for strong and productive engagement of Canadians in international development. Our last speaker, Dr. Peter Singer, has dedicated the last decade to bringing science and innovation to tackle the health challenges of the world's poorest people. He is well known around the world for his creative solutions to some of the most pressing global health problems. Dr. Singer is Chief Executive Officer of Grand Challenges Canada. He is also Director at the Sandra Rotman Centre at the University Health Network, Professor of Medicine at University of Toronto, and the Foreign Secretary of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Well, good morning. Good morning and welcome to our first session this morning. Bienvenue à notre première séance. Tout d'abord, je veux dire que...
First and foremost, I will be asking my questions only in English. However, if you wish to speak French, do not hesitate.
For us to start our time together and start our discussion, it's all about context. My role today is essentially to be a pilot. I'm going to be a pilot of two kinds of transport devices. One, Peter, that's innovative, we haven't invented yet, and one perhaps is a little bit more well-known. I'm going to take you on a bit of in a time machine. We're going to look back and look at Canada's contribution to global health, and also look forward. I'm going to ask our panelists to think a little bit about the direction that we're going. But probably the most important role that I'm going to play today is as a helicopter pilot. We are going to, for this first session, go up to 10,000 feet and look at the big picture view. Now, I said helicopter rather than airplane because we are in the course of our conversation, and maybe through your comments, we're going to come down, but I'm going to keep the rotors moving so that we constantly keep coming back up. And here's my goal. My goal is at the end of this session, you will feel frustrated. What I mean by that is you'll feel frustrated because you'll say, but we didn't go deep enough. We really want to explore that. And that's fantastic, because we're going to set the stage for conversations that will be happening throughout the course of today and tomorrow. In terms of the flow of our presentation today, I have three main questions that will allow our panelists to speak. We're going to have, if time allows, I'm assuming you'll start my clock pretty soon, but as time allows, we will have 2 points where we can get some audience participation, some participant feedback. There, now I just lost 6 minutes in just that, that short time frame. But I am also going to try to keep our panelists on track because we have a tight time frame, and we want to get to land those helicopters in some of our breakout sessions. You heard the really interesting biographies of the various panelists, but sometimes we focus on accomplishments, what people have done in their academic career or contributed in the civil service, from Carolyn's example. But I did say to them, I'd like each of them to share a little bit and share with you a sense of their heart for this work. And just one or two questions I want to ask each of you. What is it that makes you excited about being here and about this conversation? Kelley, maybe I can just start with you.
Sure. Thank you. It's great to be here. Good morning, everyone. I think what makes me excited to be here is it takes me back to being a student so many years ago. I won't say how long. I was an international relations student, and I really wanted to understand why the world was the way it was. So I didn't start out in the health field, and many of you may have been the same, but health is such a lens and such a gauge of the way the world works and the way that politics particularly works. So if you can improve health, you need to improve politics. And I think to improve politics, you need to improve health. So that relationship has really driven my interest in this field.
Thanks. Carolyn.
Eh bien, moi, je suis, en passant...
Good morning to you all. I'm very happy to see you all. I am extremely proud. I am not a doctor. I am not a health specialist. However, in my job, I have the pleasure of working with Canadian organizations, and I must say that each and every day through our projects, I see your expertise. I see what Canada has to offer in the field of health, and it makes me extremely proud. And I was extremely proud when, during a World Summit, we recognized that Canadians are really involved in the world, which means that I am extremely proud to go to work every day.
I feel passionate about this topic probably for the same reason that everyone in the room does, about the people that I've met that have been touched by the work that is being done by people in the room. So, for example, in our case, it's the two adolescent girls in Bihar in India who told me they wanted to be teachers, but who otherwise would have died but for a project searching out neglected tropical diseases, visceral leishmaniasis in an innovative way. It's the woman in Haiti who set a checkered tablecloth, the little flower in the middle of it when we came to visit. She'd suffered her whole life from epilepsy, and based on an innovative outreach project that was supported by Canada, where she was actually found in a church with a seizure, she was put on a simple anti-epileptic medicine, and her life was completely changed. Or the baby who had clean cord care and chlorhexidine in Nepal, who has a higher likelihood of survival. So that's why I feel passionate about the topic, is because of the people I've met whose lives have been improved. But I also feel angry about it. Last week I was in Nigeria, in Borno State, in Maiduguri, which is the Boko Haram territory, and went to an internally displaced persons camp where tons of people, tons of women and children, often held back by policemen with little sticks. And remember seeing on a mat a little girl dressed in a yellow dress, just sitting there. And I think about my own daughters. I think about, that girl is starting life at a real disadvantage, and it's not fair, and that's what makes me angry. And the situation's getting a little bit better, but there's no obvious, easy solution in sight. So I feel extremely passionate about what's been accomplished, and share Carolyn's pride in Canada, but also feel angry about the remaining conditions, which just says how much work we have left to do together.
Yeah, and let's see if we can channel that anger into future, forward action. Well, thank you to all of you for sharing your personal thoughts. Kelley, I'm going to start with you, actually, as we go in our time machine and look back and up into our helicopter. Kelley, you recently co-authored a series in The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, on the legacy and future of Canadian leadership in global health. And you gave some actionable messages and some recommendations. And I know you've got a presentation that you'd like to take us through just to give some high level and probably about 5 minutes views on that. Here's the clicker if you'd like to use it.
All right, I'm going to break the rules and go up.
That's great.
I always like to break the rules. Okay, so yes, we did publish and launch the first Lancet series on Canada in February, and it comprised 2 papers, one on the domestic health system, which I really recommend, led by a team, written by a team led by Danielle Martin, and our paper, which was on Canada's leadership in global health. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. It was commissioned by The Lancet, and we were pushed to do more than just engage in a kind of high-five exercise, you know, telling ourselves how awesome we are. That wouldn't have been very Canadian anyway, so what we were pushed to do really was to be really self-reflective and sometimes very critical, and to look at it warts and all, to distinguish what is it that makes contributions by Canada Canadian. So we had to do all of this, of course, because it was a Lancet, all in 6 months and all under 5,000 words. So I'm going to try and summarize this in 5 minutes. Let me just use this. So the big green button. Good. There we are, their launch. So what we concluded was that Canada's aspirations in global health and what we managed to achieve so far is very much embedded in our the history of our country, how it was forged with its large geography and its great diversity of populations. And so in this forging of our country, health equity has become core to our DNA. You know, it's what defines our country. And because this has defined us domestically, it's also shaped how we have behaved globally. The second point is that Canada remains a work in progress, and we've heard this before, of course, but we remain a nation-building country. We haven't finished. We have newcomers every year. We also have our Indigenous peoples, and we have a history of colonization, which we haven't really addressed yet. So we're still a nation in progress, and this has also defined how we are in behaving global health. But at the same time, we have influence. We have influence as a middle power, particularly, and we have a capacity to punch above our weight if we are strategic. And what our paper has argued is that we, as a country, often rely on alliances with like-minded countries. We like to work through multilateral channels, and that we have equity and human rights very much at the center of our work. So our history of leadership in global health has at times reflected this. And we have, of course, an illustrious history of scientific discoveries. We came up very quickly with a long list of impressive Canadian health research, for example, spanning the biomedical sciences, population, and public health. And some of these achievements we captured in a panel in the paper. From the discovery of insulin in 1921 to the development of a vaccine for Ebola virus in 2015. So these are remarkable achievements for our country, and we should be justifiably proud of those. But that was not all that we were tasked to do, as I said earlier. Our task was really to define the essence of Canadian leadership in global health. And what we went on to do was discover that we actually led a lot of global governance, global health governance initiatives. And some of these are listed on this slide. And what they reflect is our support for collective action, for the social determinants of health, and really a common seam of values and aspirations that reflect our own country. And I think that was a very interesting argument that we've put forward that maybe we may want to think about in the next 2 days is how much the Muskoka Initiative or the Feminist policy actually also reflects this. So in terms of resources, which are always important. We have backed, to some extent, our aspirations and our values as a middle power with resources. In terms of ODA, Official Development Assistance, the report card would probably say good, but could do better. Probably could do a lot better, and we're starting to turn this corner. On development assistance, we've done much better, and the numbers are impressive. We're ranked now 3rd behind the UK and US, so that's something to be proud of. And we channel our aid in very interesting ways, through multilateral channels, increasingly through NGOs, but there's a degree of fragmentation that we found in our work. So distributing our resources too thinly over a large number of initiatives, and there are challenges with that. So finally, in my 5 minutes, I just wanted to end with these recommendations that we put forward in our paper. The first is that we need to really draw from our history of diversity and nation building. We have something to say to the world, I think, by our own struggles. And these struggles are ongoing, but I think we could reflect that more in our global health workforce. Secondly, we need to think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and we recommend that all 94 recommendations be implemented as soon as possible. And I think that's a non-negotiable one. Thirdly, we counsel against what we have seen before, a Canada First agenda. We've learned that detracts from our reputation abroad, but it also doesn't achieve what we want to achieve in terms of global health, which really epitomizes the link between national interests and global citizenship. So that's a lesson that we've put forward. Fourthly, we need a global health strategy. We still haven't got one, and I know that Peter's report in 2011 called for a global health strategy. I believe, our group believed that this was a very good recommendation that still needs to be followed. And finally, we say that fine words are not enough. We've heard many fine words over the recent times. Our lack of generosity in ODA doesn't back up our words, and some of our Canadian companies abroad do not back up our values. So we need a world where, we need a sort of a Canadian presence in the world where we really do walk the talk. And hopefully we will get there in the end. So those are our lessons that we put forward. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear, especially with this experienced group, whether these resonate with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Kelley. I love this idea of a report card where we have some areas of improvement, but I also think that if we look back, we can probably tick the box that says Canada plays well with others, right? And perhaps we're at our best when we're like that. I want to turn now to Peter. Peter, you know, we all know here, one of the reasons that we're here is that at the 2010 G8 summit in Huntsville, the Government of Canada made an unprecedented commitment to maternal and newborn child health. Government renewed that commitment in 2014, Muskoka 1 and 2. And Peter, I'd really like to think about that. That's a distinctly Canadian contribution in the context of this big picture. What are your thoughts on the Muskoka outcomes and the process of engagement and advocacy that was linked to that?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I mean, just starting with the process, I think the process by which we're engaged in global health, in women and children's health here, is really very special. In a sense, it's a living version of the strategy that Kelley was talking about. I'm unaware of another country where 100 civil society organizations or more work so closely collaboratively together. I mean, that's a very, very special thing under the leadership, Helen, of CanWatch and all your colleagues that has been pulled together. And I think we ought to celebrate that. That really is an extremely important process achievement. Similarly, I think the way that whole community interfaces with government, Caroline, is very, very special. And a real credit to you and your colleagues in global affairs for being so open, and you can see it in this conference as well. That, of course, is instantiated in in that 2010 G8 decision, and it's just very obvious in terms of the trust and in terms of the relationship. So process, it's actually hard for me to think about how that could be improved. Those, I think, are really meaningful relationships. And, speaking personally, some of the finest people I've met and some of the finest and most dedicated and committed leaders have been from amongst those civil society organizations, government colleagues, et cetera. It's been really deeply, deeply meaningful and very humbling. On the outcomes point of view, I want to give a more nuanced answer. You asked about process and outcomes related to Muskoka. I actually think the outcomes that the people in this room are achieving are really, really fantastic. But my headline for outcomes is we're hiding our light under a bushel. And I did a little experiment in the last few days with a couple of colleagues. I went and searched every document I could to see what was the best expression of Muskoka outcomes that I could find that was publicly available. And the best, and it's not easy actually to find a really good publicly available expression of outcomes. Probably the best one we were able to find was actually the 2016-17 report of Global Affairs Canada to Parliament. Now, by the way, this is archived on some webpage somewhere, so it's already archived, even though it's the most recent. It's not easy to find. But when you read that, it's actually really quite good. Just to give you a sense, there's a page with graphics on there. Now remember, this is development assistance generally, not Muskoka specifically. You can see the inputs, the amount of money spent. You can see some breakdowns of inputs. Here's how much was spent in Africa, for example. You can see some outputs, for example, impact on gender equality. And then you can even see some outcomes, but organization by organization and mostly multilateral. So for example, it says the Global Partnership on Education educated XYZ number of girls, and UNICEF immunized, it was actually child and forced marriage. There's not much on NGOs on that kind of, it's mostly multilaterals. There's not much on aggregate outcomes. So for example, Gavi would say X billion dollars in, Y million children immunized out. Now, that's an easier thing to do because it's a more homogeneous outcome, right? But even in cases of heterogeneous outcomes, the World Health Organization this year came out with a target of the triple billion, 1 billion more people on universal health coverage, 1 billion more people better protected from health emergencies, 1 billion people enjoying better health and well-being. So that kind of aggregate outcome is possible. What GFF does is it does it at the country level. It's looking at country level, and in fact the Global Affairs Canada report also has country level things. So if we could report just as well as in that Global Affairs Canada thing, report to Parliament, but make it a little bit more specific on the Muskoka Feminist International Assistance Policy outcomes, so you're really looking at it a little more programmatically, and not hide it quite so well. That would be really, really amazing, and I hope we can really focus in on that over the next couple of days.
Well, let's come back to that, because we're going to have some conversation around.
At the end of the day, Michael, it's the only thing that matters.
Right.
And the stories of the people who are touched.
Like the stories you shared earlier. I mean, they're very powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to turn to Carolyn in just a moment, but do think about some questions or comments you'd like on this broad perspective. We probably will have time for one or two before we move into the second part of our panel. But Carolyn, Canada is recognized globally for its Muskoka initiative and now for its bold leadership agenda under the Feminist International Assistance Policy. Tell us a little bit about the new developments from Global Affairs. Maybe you can frame it however you'd like, but if you want to help us draw the line between where we've come from and where we are today.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So from Muskoka to now, in my mind, is a story of leadership along three lines. The first one in terms of influencing and setting a global agenda. The second, I would say, in terms of bringing the pieces together that you need to be successful. And the third one, in terms of results. On the first one, as an influencer, I think that the Lancet series did a really good job at highlighting our leadership there. A piece that I think that needs to come out more, that Peter touched upon, is really our leadership through Canadian organizations, Canadian civil society, and the private sector. And that's emerged significantly over the last decade. We've seen much deeper engagement. Canadian organizations having real connections with partners in the field, integrated into national systems and influencing health systems, and also being part of sort of catalytic organizations such as Nutrition International and the Sun Movement. So we do, as a partnership, influence a global agenda, and the parliamentary secretary referenced last year's conference, the first CanWatch conference, where Canada really helped have the global community recognize the importance of empowering adolescent girls. So that's, I think, one way our leadership has evolved in terms of our partnership. Now, in terms of building the pieces to achieve success, it comes in various forms. It's obviously having evidence-based policies, being innovative, and funding. It's also about money. In terms of evidence-based policies, we went from the MDGs, which had a fairly vertical focus on sectors, to the SDGs, which are integrated in looking at taking comprehensive solutions to development issues, which is sort of the same spirit that the Feminist International Assistance Policy is set into. And the policy is very much anchored into the SDGs and into leaving no one behind. And it's about working through SDG 5, leveraging equality and empowering women as a way to achieve a range of SDGs or development outcomes. It's not an exclusive policy. It's about working with women, girls, adolescents, men, and boys in terms of achieving equality. It's also a policy that's activist. It's human rights based. It's about tackling norms and behaviors. And from a health perspective, it really looks at putting women and girls at the center of our interventions. And I'm remiss that Peter didn't speak about innovation, because this is certainly something that we learned through Muskoka 1, is that, and we know with the SDGs, that business as usual will not get us to 2030. We need to do development better. We need to do things differently. We need better solutions. And I'm quite proud when we started working with Grand Challenges Canada to bring innovative solutions to health. And the last piece I'll touch upon in sort of this sort of stream is about leveraging financing. And you can do that by being a convener. The government convened the international community last year for the replenishment of the Global Fund, which was very successful, but also in terms of innovative financing mechanisms. And we were part of funding and founding the Global Financing Facility. So those are actually pieces that we've built along the way. Now, the third, in terms of achieving results, and I agree with Peter that we do see results, great results actually, from 10 years of, almost 10 years, a decade of investment in MNCH. And if you go back and Google, what you will find the summative evaluation of Muskoka 1. And what we're currently doing is actually, it's not, you know, we didn't have an epiphany, it didn't fall from the sky in terms of what needed to be fixed there. The first one, data. Having good data at the outset to define your programming strategies, engaging women organizations from the outset, a better performance measurement framework for results reporting, but also one of the findings of Muskoka 1 is that we needed to address the gaps in MNCH. We needed to look at adolescent girls, and we needed to work on sexual health, sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls. So, and that is, I think, a big part of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And again, this morning, the Parliamentary Secretary mentioned $650 million investment to tackle sexual and reproductive health and rights, including the call for preliminary proposals that we've launched recently to address the gaps in MNCH. So like Kelley and like Peter, I really look forward to the next couple of days, and I find that CanWatch has done a fabulous job at setting up an agenda that's going to help us reflect on how we need to shift our approaches a bit to meet the challenges of the SDGs and of the new policy, how we can learn better together and tell the story of the results we're achieving, and how we can set ourselves up to be successful post-2020.
Thank you, Carolyn. It is encouraging for us to think about the progress we've made, also being open and recognizing the gaps between Muskoka and the needs to fill in those gaps. We've made progress on MNCH and SRHR. But one of the things that we'll be talking about here at the conference is also about trying to recognize that a healthy and fulfilled life has a variety of interventions, this lifestyle approach. Support for education, child protection, empowerment through the whole stage of the life cycle will be something for us to think about. And that may be something you'd like to prompt the panelists now. We're going to take just a couple of moments. We'll have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions that we'll gather and pose to the panelists. If you are making an intervention, I encourage you, now's not the time for big speeches. Give us the headlines, something that you'd like to hear the panelists talk about, and we'll certainly make note and carry forward. As you're coming to the microphones, though, maybe what I can do, we've heard a lot about the good work of the organizations in this room working together. Why don't you just turn to the person next to you, shake their hands, and say congratulations. Thank them, and then we'll wait for people to come to the mics.
Congratulations.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Peter. Good job, Mike.
Well done, well done.
Awesome job.
I think we do that in church.
Yes, in the Mass.
Yeah.
So do we have any questions or comments for the panelists at this stage? All right, well, there will be another opportunity. We'll save those up. I guess we're keeping your attention. So why don't we move on then to the next area, a bit more of a conversation piece. One of the areas that has been identified as a gap, Kelley, you mentioned it, in fact, we'll come to you first maybe, is around the need of engagement. We're behind in progress on Indigenous health. We've recently seen the government undertake a reshaping of the organizational structure and processes at the federal level. Would love to hear how you see this maybe impacting First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities, what else we need to do from your perspective. And then I'll ask Peter and Carolyn to touch on this as well.
Sure.
Kelley.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm not an Indigenous health expert, but I have been starting to work with Indigenous populations and communities, so I'm learning a lot. So we know all the dire, stark statistics about health inequities in these communities, and the shift in tone by the government and the organizational restructuring and the increased resources, all very welcome, long overdue, but certainly very welcome. I think Canada, as other settler societies, are only beginning to really recognize and address the history we have of colonization and marginalized populations as a result over many generations. So we've made a start. My Indigenous colleagues tell me that there is a window of opportunity they see here. They're encouraged by this, but they've also seen it before. And so there's I guess a cautious optimism that something will change this time.
The need, in a sense, to walk the talk, as you said before.
To walk the talk, yes. And so they're hoping. But I think what would make a difference, and I think this is something I'm learning in my work, is really about meaningful, authentic, genuine engagement. And this is something that takes time and it takes a lot of effort. It is not always efficient or within the political cycles. It's going to take time, but it's about listening and humility and cultural safety, all of these things that I think we all need to learn. I think if we're going to be really, truly committed to this, we need to be real, true partners. We need to engage Indigenous communities as true partners, as true collaborators, as fellow Canadians. And this is something very simple, but we've struggled with this. My university's at ground zero of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. I'm up at Burnaby Mountain. And so I feel very much that this is an important moment for us to think, are we, what is our national interest? And if it's, as soon as it costs us something, this whole idea about Indigenous consent goes out the window. So this is a real litmus test for us, I think, not just because I'm on Burnaby Mountain, but I think the whole country needs to think about this. We're at a difficult time, and it's, again, about work in progress and nation building. So I think it's a really interesting opportunity for us to demonstrate our real commitment.
Great. Thanks, Kelley. Peter, your thoughts on this, particularly around Indigenous health?
Yeah, I mean, for starters, is there a single person in this room who doesn't think that Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples is the biggest shame and stain on the history of our country? Let's just start there. Okay, everyone's nodding. Raise your hand if you think that's not true. Okay, that's not a bad, I mean, that really is the place of humility, and Kelley, I really have to endorse, that's the place we start. Secondly, I think there's a particular connection between that shameful history and women and children's health. Because what the residential schools really did was they severed the bond of parenting between parents and their children. And if you just think about all the science that we have on Thrive and the Thrive agenda for children and early child development, that is I mean, if you were an evil scientist and your goal was to make sure that generations of people in a particular population would remain poor, would remain with mental health, drug and alcohol, all kinds of health, that's actually the best way to do it. So there's a particular responsibility, I think, that our sector has. Thirdly, we've now had at least 2 reports, the 2011 one that Kelley mentioned that I chaired for the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and the report Kelley just did, that say Indigenous health is a proof point for global health. We can't separate the two. And without doing some serious work on Indigenous health, our legitimacy really in global health, I think is the word. So fourth point, it's very frustrating though, because the calls for action with no action, this is the point you were making, are very frustrating. But I think there is potentially a way in. The McConnell Foundation, working with Indigenous leaders over the past few years, has been supporting innovation in Indigenous people. So Indigenous people themselves are innovating against their own problems. They funded Indigenous innovation conferences, and now there's actually been a launch of a pre-launch of an Indigenous innovation initiative between McConnell. We're hosting it at Grand Challenges Canada. It's led by Indigenous leaders, and so I do see some potential for optimism. And then finally, the point I would make is just a very simple one, and we'll come to innovation, I think, when we talk a little bit later about Budget 2018. Yeah. But and it's really a call to our friends in Global Affairs Canada. If you could just take what you learned about innovation over the past 5 or 10 years as it's now been institutionalized actually in Budget 2018, something we'll talk about. And you could talk to your friends in Indigenous services, and you could show them how that has actually improved the effectiveness and efficiency of public spending by enabling people to innovate and solve their own problems. In the case of development, that's low and middle income country innovators. In the case of Indigenous, it's Indigenous people themselves. And the Indigenous Innovation Initiative is led by Indigenous people, and we've been indigenizing Grand Challenge Canada. So there's a very concrete thing that can be done.
There's a lesson that can be learned.
Well, and cross-learning between, if you think about it, these are two very big spending government departments. There's a lot of money going through Global Affairs Canada in development. There's a lot of money going through Indigenous services. There is a responsibility, I think we all have, to make sure that those funds really achieve the best results.
And I'm going to just interrupt you there because I want to make sure we do have
but a very specific proposal,
okay,
which is how our colleagues here can actually lead by taking the learnings and sharing them and engaging their colleagues at Indigenous Services.
Great. Carolyn, I'm not asking you necessarily to respond to Peter, you can, but do you have any contribution you'd like to make?
Sure. For us, and for me as a public servant, I felt there was a weight lifted off my shoulders when Canada endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And I did not expect the Prime Minister to make the speech he made at the UN General Assembly. And I thought that was also quite an important moment in terms of setting the tone. I was at a meeting that Minister Bibeau had with the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Perry Bellegarde, where we wanted to look at how perhaps we could work together, international development, and perhaps favoring community-to-community engagement. And what came out of there, or my perception was that the chief sort of felt there's so much work to be done domestically. I haven't had time to think about even how we connect globally. Sort of stepping back from that, in my mind, I feel that the SDGs and implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in Canada and globally, and the way they're universal and then they're interconnected, are actually going to facilitate this sort of interaction between the domestic and the international. And I absolutely take your point, Peter, in terms of there's obviously a big role for the federal family, and then us at Global Affairs, how we can facilitate that by sharing lessons learned of innovation, but also to you, colleagues, Canadian civil society organizations and the private sector, also at the community level, all the expertise that we have to share, that you can share with local community-based organization, with Indigenous organization, in terms of building capacity and facilitating those connections.
Thanks. You can tell we could talk about this topic for some time, and we're gonna move on to something else at this stage. But if you're feeling frustrated about that, I'm doing my job. So remember to think about those questions. Some opportunity for some short and snappy responses here around engaging Canadians. We saw today the video. Helen presented the Lead on Canada en Tête campaign. We've talked about engaging populations in the matters that impact them, but we've had challenges about engaging Canadians. The public opinion survey that we did, here are some things that we learned. Women and children's health ranked below climate change, global economic stability, poverty and hunger, and gender equality as a priority global issue for Canadians. Only 8% of Canadians identified health and well-being of mothers and children in developing countries as a priority issue. And that was actually a drop of 2% since we did the same study in 2015. At the same time, though, 6 in 10 Canadians say they feel a sense of pride in Canada's role. We saw some of the reasons for that from Kelley's presentation. And that was significantly higher than 2 years ago. So my takeaway is that there's an opportunity here. The Canadians are interested, but we need to get that information. We need to get the light out from under the bushel. So my question to the panel, just quickly, and I think I'll start with you, Carolyn. How can we communicate to Canadians better?
Well, thank you for setting me up with a really tough one.
You can be short and snappy.
Oh, I'm not known to be short and snappy, but I am short. I have great hopes for the campaign that CanWatch is working on. I do think this is going to be a really good experiment to see what works with Canadians, and I find that the way it's being set up in terms of how we're going to measure also its impact, we're going to learn a lot, because we haven't been really good at measuring at metrics on Canadian engagement, what works and what doesn't. So that's one piece. Second, also, I think we have an issue of language. You mentioned climate change, and Canadians are becoming quite articulate in terms of understanding emissions reductions and the environment. I have to tell you that if I talk to my kids, they don't know about family planning. They're not planning a family. They know about contraception, but they don't know what family planning means, right? So there's something about the language that we use to communicate, which I think has to change. We also have to be much better, and I circle back to the results, at communicating those results. And I mean, I know we want to have the big convincing, and here's how we move the yardstick on health. But actually, people relate to stories, individual stories. So when I think of results, I see them, they're all individual, they're like stars. They're little stars in the sky. And when you step back, you sort of have to try to draw a line, and then all of a sudden you see a constellation, and that's sort of aggregation. And we want to see the constellation, we want to show the universe. And sometimes you have to do that, I think, for accountability purposes, but sometimes also you have to point to the stars. And I'd really like to see us ship out those stories of, you know, that woman that you met and the kids that I saw, and the actually much more frequently, and with language that people can relate to.
Mm-hmm. So we're moving from time machine to helicopter, now spaceship. Mm-hmm. But I think that's fantastic. You know, it's making that link between the big picture stories and statistics of impact, but linked to personal stories. Kelley, you're kind of an insider and outsider in this conversation, you know, in global health for sure, in this piece. What advice would you have for us in communicating with Canadians?
Well, I think I would remind Canadians that we're the 10th most globalized country in the world, apparently. There's some ranking out there, which means that we are very integrated with the world out there. And I'd like to think Canadians have a sense of that. I mean, most of us are non-Indigenous. Most of us either came from somewhere else or our ancestors did. And we have links with the world. And I think, you know, reminding people that if we have a world out there that's defined by inequities and poor health and insecurity, that we cannot build walls and we cannot insulate ourselves. So I try and teach that to our students. I think most Canadians kind of get that. And I think if we tap into that, I think we could reframe this issue as not just a finite, you know, either or, that we can do both. We can have good health at home, but we can also support good health abroad.
Peter, I'm going to ask you a question about the budget. But do you have a super short and snappy response?
Yes, I want to align myself with what Carolyn said. We call it the box of chocolate strategy, because everybody likes their own particular chocolate in a box of chocolates. The time we get the best domestic coverage in any release we do in Grand Challenges Canada is our STARS program. And that's when we release individual stories right across the country of innovators that are achieving great things. And the Saskatoon paper picks up the Saskatoon innovator, and the Halifax paper picks up the Halifax innovator. So just et cetera, right across the country. Chicoutimi picks up Chicoutimi. So just to really align myself with what Carolyn said, I think she's absolutely right. And there's a pivot from accountability to public engagement when you shift from you know, aggregate numbers, et cetera, to the box of chocolate strategy, which is what I think you were really endorsing.
And from our organization,
Was that short enough?
It was pretty good. It was pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, we often try.
That means no. Congratulations, you're doing great work.
It was snappy. Short, I don't know. Anyway, we have to do our part to try to reduce the proximity gap, I think, and try to make connections. When Canadians feel connected as a father I, as a mother I, you know, those kind of connections, and we see what's happening globally, people resonate that way. Well, I did promise some questions on the budget. I'm just going to give this one to you, and we can open up to the panel. And after this, we have about 15 minutes that we would like to hear some questions and comments from the audience. But as you think about your question and maybe even come to the microphone, let's talk briefly about the 2018 budget. There were some exciting developments there, including an additional $2 billion over 5 years of new and additional money to the international assistance envelope to support FIAP, and also humanitarian assistance. And certainly from our organization, we were pleased to see this. It was a positive step in the right direction, which is good. And also the focus on the most vulnerable and fragile context is important as well. But Peter, what are your thoughts on the 2018 budget?
I think Budget 2018 was very important because for me what it did was it institutionalized innovation as a core part of Canada's development strategy. You know, we have a very proud history with IDRC and the various initiatives you mentioned, Global Health Research Initiative, Grand Chance, et cetera, Grand Chance Canada, et cetera. But it was never really institutionalized. They were each ad hoc. And there's $1.5 billion in there over 5 years for the International Innovation Assistance Program and the Sovereign Loans Program, which has to do with innovation, scaling innovation, different types of blended finance. And to me, that institutionalizes innovation as part of Canada's development strategy. I think that's really important in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, because we won't reach them by doing the same things. We'll only reach them by doing an intelligent mix of doing things differently, which is called innovation, and scaling programs against immediate needs. That's called programming. And so this is, I think, an area of comparative advantage for Canada. I'm unaware of another country now that has so clearly institutionalized. And just like Canada was the first country, actually, to take a Grand Challenges approach to innovation, it's, I think, the first country really to firmly institutionalize. Maybe the Global Development Lab and USAID, et cetera, but it's in a tier of countries now that send a clear message that we're going to do things differently to achieve results. It's innovation with impact. It sets Canada apart, and it says to me, innovation now is institutionalized as a core part of international development. And I don't think we can take that for granted, or we could take it for granted until that budget. So the money's good, but for me, that focused message is really, really important. I just want to congratulate everybody in the room who actually reached that result from the innovative work that you're doing. And again, to get back to the first thing I said, the relationship between everybody in the room and the colleagues at Global Affairs Canada, I think, led to that very good result for our country and for people around the world.
Thanks, Peter. I know that all of our panelists could speak to this, but we want to hear from you. Do you have thoughts on the budget? Thoughts on the historical context for global health, the opportunities that we have, even thinking post-2020? Come on up to the microphones, and I just invite you to introduce yourself first, and then please, brief, short comments. We're going to gather, and then I'll put them to the panelists together. Stan?
Stan Zlotkin, Center for Global Child Health, Hospital for Sick Children. Great panel, thank you very much. Comment or question about public engagement and a story, because you all told stories and they're the best thing. Last Friday, I had the wonderful opportunity to be a keynote speaker at something called the Global Ideas Institute, which is a University of Toronto program for high school students. There were 200 high school students in the room who had so much enthusiasm for the work they were doing around global health. Their project from September until now was to work on innovative solutions in Canada for food insecurity. So one of the issues I think we perhaps could focus on for engagement would be engaging the youth of Canada.
Great.
The second is that unlike America, which is a melting pot, you take new immigrants, you throw them in a pot, and they come out to be Americans. Canada, thank goodness, is a mosaic. we encourage people to maintain their connections with the countries they come from. I think if we focus on individuals in our mosaic and focus on the countries they came from and the issues and problems that they have, I think that might help us with public engagement. So two, one is youth and two is our mosaic.
Great. We'll get the another comment, and then we'll put it to the panel.
I'm Johannes Paulus. I'm a master's student at York University. We've spoken much about data and success and impact, but my question is, how do we measure success when working in rural communities if their language of success means something different from what we are measuring?
Can you say a bit more about that? What do you mean the language of success?
For example, I was talking to a friend in rural Nigeria, and he told me that their school don't have a toilet. And what happened was WHO, through a funded program by WHO, they had built a toilet with flushing system of water. But that toilet is not being used for many years. And it therefore means that the community wasn't that much consulted and it wasn't meaningful to them. So how do we, going forward, try to understand the language of the people that we are working to improve their lives? So.
Great, thank you. Any other comments or questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi there. My name is Jan Kristalai. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist from Vancouver. I was president of Women's Hospital until a few months ago. My passion really has to do with capacity building and surgical training in the world. And I just wanted to make a comment about the interface between Indigenous health and global health, because I think it is pivotal for us to look at this as Canadians. And recently I had the opportunity to co-lead a meeting for rural health in Canada with Nadine Caron, who many of you may know is a surgeon, Indigenous surgeon in Canada. And what we really started to realize is that the training that we're doing for rural physicians in northern Canada is exactly the same training that we're using in rural Tanzania. I would love to see us actually build around this specific interface. I would love to see calls for something that actually does both of these things at the same time. It just seems to me that this is an area where we have not really reached our potential, and I'd love to hear people talk about that. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Well, thanks for those. I'm going to put them to the panel. Maybe we'll start with the last one. Actually, Kelley, do you have a perspective on that?
I think that's a wonderful suggestion. I think that's sort of what Peter was trying to say when he was bringing the two departments together. Nadine is wonderful. I have also wonderful colleagues like Jeff Redding and Evan Adams, and they're recognizing, I think, the need for capacity, the need for building capacity within communities, and there's that saying, nothing about us without us, and so anything we can do as a global health community to support Indigenous health is clearly a no-brainer. I think we need to recognize that we can bring commonalities and lessons that we've learned in other resource-constrained areas. I think Indigenous health, though, is distinct in that it's a very much, the community is very diverse. The number of languages, the number of nations, and the number of diversity of needs. So, we can't speak about Indigenous health in a kind of homogenous way. But I think you're right. We have a really good opportunity here to draw some lessons across those areas.
Great suggestion. Johannes raised the question about the language of success. I think it had to do with really deep engagement with communities to truly understand internationally. I wonder, Carolyn, from your perspective, do you have any thoughts on how we can make sure that when we are engaging with communities to suggest interventions, that we really are responding to needs and we're listening to the needs and expectations and understanding of the community?
Sure. I have to say, when Stan said youth, my mind started going, so I've been thinking about
well, we can come back to it.
But yeah, I'll come back to it. No, yeah. I do believe that the gentleman that asked the question answered his own question, because he pointed to the importance of engaging with the community and understanding the need. And that is actually one of the the findings of many of our evaluations actually is that having the information and the data up front in terms of understanding what we're actually dealing with, beyond just the need for a toilet or latrines, there's sort of the social norms and the context around it, whether they're being used or not and why not. So that's sort of the peeling the onion that we need to do. And when I was in Kenya, I think with Steve from the Aga Khan Foundation Canada a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at, we were talking about pregnant teenagers. And sort of, you would have had your normal response in terms of how you deal with that, contraception, this, that, and the other thing. But the issue, and then research was done, and uncovered that the issue is that they were trading sex for a ride to school. So that our traditional approach would not have worked. What we need to do is give them bicycles to get to school. So I think we have to, something I think we need to do is build research into our projects. Build it up front, make sure we understand the context, and then that offers you such a great basis to do your monitoring and your results, and just check in more regularly to see whether our interventions are actually achieving results.
Okay, great. Just to my colleague at the microphone, we probably won't be able to take another comment at this point, but save it for a future session, please. And but Carolyn,
can I talk about youth?
Yes, I want to give it to you. You're so excited about this, and then Peter, I'll have you speak to that too.
I'm a youth wannabe. I agree. I mean, Stan, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there is so much potential if we could engage youth. But I actually do think it's in the sort of older segment of youth. Statistics Canada has done, I'm actually looking at this from a public servant perspective, so I won't be the most innovative, but I'm looking to you. I think we need to have innovative ways to engage youth. But they did a marvelous study of youth from 15 to I think 35, so they barely missed us.
Speak for yourself.
And there's sort of a cohort that's from 19 to 25. It's actually the biggest cohort. They're educated, they're engaged, and they're connected. But then they share some of the same challenges that youth in developing countries share. They have mental health issues. They have a hard time securing good employment. They feel disengaged sometimes. So I do think that if we were able to connect with them and really generate a movement, more of a movement, not, your traditional, would you like to come in and have a chit chat, and would you like to donate, and would you like to go and do an internship, and would you like to volunteer? This is all great and amazing, but how do we generate a movement when they're actually truly connected and connecting into development issues and with developing countries? I actually think that there's a place where that exists somewhere. We should be able to do that. What we're trying to do from a very technocratic public service perspective, obviously the Prime Minister is a Minister for Youth. He's not in that cohort either, I should point out. But launched in January an initiative with youth that's initially sort of domestically focused, but it will have an international component. So I think we should look to leverage that and see for example, with the Can Watch campaign, whether we can connect into the sort of the engagement that's being done through that initiative. And we can talk about it more, Helen, after this.
Great, thank you. Peter, you literally have 1.5 minutes if you wanted to add anything on Stan's suggestion around engaging with youth or public engagement.
And I think it also blends with the cultural mosaic thing, because there's a tapestry of youth in Canada. I think the issue is, how do you move from youth engagement to youth action? That's really the issue. How do you channel that energy, which is so obvious, for example, in the anti-gun movement in the United States at the moment? How do you channel that energy of engagement into action? I think youth are naturally inclined to innovate. And so offering young people opportunities, even just small little bits of support, hackathons, other types of engagement, to innovate, to channel it concretely. Here's a problem we'd like you to solve, or you would like to solve. Find some way to support. So for me, just in a nutshell, it's about making the leap from youth engagement, which is really important and really great, to really concrete action. That's where I think a lot of us. That's where I think a lot of the organizations engaging youth maybe fall down. Is how do you constructively channel that to make to really achieve some outcomes? Because that's where actually the ability is. In the World Health Organization, at 10 seconds. It's the young people there that are actually, it's undergoing now reform under Dr. Tedros, new Director General, but it's the young people in the organization that are revitalizing it through a strategy of innovation, through the creation of an innovation hub. So again, I've learned there's this natural relationship, and then the challenge there too is how do you go beyond just talking about innovation and engaging youth to actually channeling that energy to doing something that has true results, which is more meaningful for them and more meaningful for the world.
Oh, thanks. Thanks. Great insights and really good questions. I know we could have a broader conversation. And maybe in the time machine that we looked at, we didn't have a chance to really go too much into the future. What does post-2020 mean? What does, when we look and learn from the lessons of the past and the present, what directions are we going? Well, those are questions you're going to have to answer this week and help us as we continue this conversation. So we're going to get back in our helicopter and fly off the stage here, but the conversation is going to continue. Will you join me in thanking our panelists who've contributed to the discussion? Thank you.